Hello and welcome to the Gotcha Guide for the Genestealer Cult. The aim of this video is to tell you all of the rules you need to know if you are not a Genestealer Cult player. So we're not going to go through every single datasheet and rule, but I'm just going to tell you the rules you need to know if you want to be to the servants of the hive mind. So let's jump in. So the faction abilities for the GSC, we've got some really interesting ones here. So firstly, the entire Genestealer Cult army can hide when you deploy. If you play GSC in 8th edition, this is pretty familiar, but if you've never played GSC before, the way this works is that GSC don't deploy models in the deployment step. What they do is they deploy blips. They still have to deploy them in the deployment zone as per usual, but they only have to deploy blips and they don't have to tell you which blip is which unit. After this, if the Genestealer Cult player goes first, they can just deploy all of the units where the blips are, deploying each unit within an inch of the blip and in their deployment zone, so that's nice and straightforward. However, if you go first against the Genestealer Cults, you actually have to move first before the Genestealer Cult player deploys their units, and you also can't move to within 9 inches of a blip, so this means that your first turn charges are incredibly unlikely. You're also going to want to be aware of the fact that Genestealer Cults can pay 2 CP to move 2 blips if they'd like to. However, if Genestealer Cult players don't want to set up their units in ambush, they can place them underground, which is basically their term for deep striking. Now this rule as well does not work like the normal deep strike or coming in for reserves type of rules that you get in most codexes, because Genestealer Cults come in over 8 inches away instead of over 9 inches away, of course, which most armies have. So when you're screening out, it is incredibly important you remember that extra inch is a pretty big deal. They can also choose, if they'd like to, however, to deep strike over 6 inches away. However, then they can't charge, but this is an incredibly powerful ability to steal an objective from you, so be really mindful of that. 6 inches means that if you toe poke an objective, they can bring down an acolyte squad, steal that objective from you, retrieve data in that corner, whatever it is that they want to do. Of course, the Genestealer Cults have access to upgrades, which I'll mention as they come up in this video, and the one you're going to want to be aware of here is that there is an upgrade to deep strike over 3 inches away, but again, then you cannot charge, but of course in this instance, really reliable for stealing objectives, etc. It's also worth noting that characters that come in from underground can still use their command abilities, which of course you can't normally do if you come in from reserves. So as we're talking about underground, just a few more upgrades to mention at this point. GSC players can have 1 unit make a 3d6 charge, discarding the lowest. That's going to be a really reliable charge, even coming out of underground. We've got an upgrade here where a crossfire unit can come in from reserves and count a unit within 12 inches as being both exposed and having a crossfire token. And then we've got a really interesting upgrade here. The GSC player can put 1 unit into strategic reserves and then count the round as 1 higher for the purposes of bringing them in. So that means that they can bring them in turn 1. And I think the main stratagem I wanted to mention here as we're talking about underground is Return to the Shadows. So this is a really powerful stratagem that will come up quite a lot, I think. So this is a 1 CP stratagem that allows a Genestealer Cult's infantry unit to go back into reserve. So you are able to use this ability after you have fought in the fight phase if there are no enemy units within 6 inches of you. So typically what might happen is a Genestealer Cults unit will come in from reserves, wipe whatever unit they're in combat with, and at this point there's going to be nothing within 6 inches of them, and so they're going to be able to go back into reserves, and so you can't deal with them until they come in the next time. So that's a pretty important rules mechanic for GSC, but there are some more. So I'm sure you've heard about Crossfire and Exposed because you've seen it on Warcom or whatever, but just to give a little bit more context for you, if you're not a Genestealer Cult player, what do you actually need to know? Well, Crossfire is basically a tracer fire ability. That's how I think you should look at it if you're not playing the faction. If your opponent hits you with 5 1-damage shots or 1 multi-damage shot in the game, a Crossfire token will be applied to that unit. And at this point, all other crossfire units that target that unit will get +1 to hit against it. So that's why I say it's like tracer fire. Exposed, on the other hand, I think you should look at as more of a pincer maneuver. So what this means, as per the example, is that if the Genestealer Cult player can see through your unit into the Achilles Ridge Runner behind your unit, then your unit will be exposed when the neophytes shoot them. And therefore the neophytes will get +1 to wound. The final part of this rule is that if you have both a crossfire marker and are exposed, and the GSC unit attacking you is within 12 inches of your unit, they will also ignore the benefits of cover when shooting against you. So really strong for taking away dense, light cover, etc. And then Unquestioning Loyalty, basically it means that Genestealer Cult characters can pass off wounds, kind of similar to how Tau drones used to work, so they can keep themselves alive by just sacrificing a nearby minion. So it can be really powerful. However, Genestealer Cults generally die pretty quickly, so just make sure you're killing whatever is around those characters if you're hoping to kill them. And the final rule I wanted to mention is Genestealer Cults summon the cult ability. This is basically their ability to heal in the game. So the way this works is that if they've got a banner in the squad, or if they're nearby the icon ward, they can heal D3 models back to that unit, or they can heal D6 models if it's a neophyte squad. The first two characters I wanted to talk about are both Psykers, so let's take a quick look at the Psychic tree, as it's still very, very good. So going into GSC, there are 4 powers I think you need to know. So there are 2 debuffs here. We've got -1 attack and fight last, and we've got -1 to hit and some leadership debuffs. Then we've got 2 powerful buff powers as well. So we've got the ability to still shoot and charge even if you fell back or advanced, and we've got the buff of +1 attack. So there's 2 relics to be aware of. One will allow a Psyker to make an extra deny the witch attempt, and when they deny, they can deny at any range, and when they are casting some powers, they'll get a +1. And then there's a relic for a free reroll every psychic phase, and any cast on a roll of a double cannot be denied. So the actual units themselves, the Magus is kind of just a standard Psyker type profile. However, they do have an aura where infantry and biker units within 6 inches get a 5-up feel no pain versus wounds in the Psychic phase. So really powerful against Grey Knights, Thousand Suns, etc. And then the Patriarch, not the scariest Tyranid you'll ever see, but he's still pretty tough to kill. He's pretty decent in combat. He's definitely got some good utility. We've got a few more HQs to look at. We've got the Primus. He's both a captain and a lieutenant. He gives a reroll 1s to hit aura and a command ability to allow a core unit to reroll 1s to wound. He can also be upgraded, so once per game he can allow 2 units to reroll 1s to wound, and then he loses the restriction for core. In combat, he's not the best, but he does have some good upgrades. His weapons kind of work like poison for Drukhari, so they always wound on a 2+ if you're not a vehicle or Titanic. And he has access to a relic here that's damage 3, pretty strong there. We already spoke about the Acolyte Icon Ward, however he also has access to an action which if he uses, models nearby will get +1 to charge for that turn. And then we've got the Jackal Alpha, so the first of the snipers we're going to look at today. She also allows an enemy unit within 36 inches to count as exposed for a core unit. At this point, let's cover the other characters in the book because there are a lot of them. However, of course, I'm just going to cover the abilities that you actually need to know if you're not a Genestealer Cult player. So let's start off with the Clamavus. Pretty nifty little unit. He has an ability where he can take away your obsec or stop you performing an action. However, he does have to beat your leadership on 3d6. He can also allow a friendly core unit to shoot and perform an action at the same time. And then he has one of those like infiltrator abilities, so you can't come in from reserves within 12 inches of him instead of the usual 9. And then the Clamavus has his own stratagem, Data Parasite. It allows the vehicle to count as half wounds for the purposes of degradation, so it can be really strong. It even works on Titanic, but it costs more CP. The Nexus is a really interesting unit. In this army, you need to be aware of 2 abilities that he has. So the first ability I wanted to discuss is basically what he allows you to do as a Genestealer Cult player is select any one of your core units on the battlefield, and that unit counts as within 6 inches of the Primus, Jackal Alphas, or Clamavus for the purposes of their auras. So typically what this will mean, for example, is the Nexus could select an Acolyte unit on the other side of the battlefield, and that unit will count as within range of that reroll 1s to hit aura, and the Primus can even select that unit as the target of his reroll 1s to wound aura. And if you're seeing the Nexus, you're pretty much always going to see his relic. It allows you to command point farm, but it also allows you to use that ability twice, so really, really strong. And then the second ability is that he can select any unit in the command phase, and that unit gains a crossfire token. Now that sounds like a nice buff at first, but let's just take a quick look at a couple of the stratagems GSC can use to prove to you how powerful this is in the context of this book. So it's worth noting that that ability has no lookout sir restriction, etc. So what you could do is select any character anywhere on the battlefield and then use covering fire in the charge phase. That stops that unit from overwatching, setting to defend, or heroically intervening. So with this ability, the GSC player can turn off heroic intervention for one of your units. And then the other stratagem here is Coordinated Assault. This will mean that the unit with a crossfire marker suffers from fight last in the fight phase, so again really powerful to disable one of your units from fighting that turn. Other characters to look at, we've got the Locust. He's quite nifty, he's got some good output, but I think the main reason you're going to see him is because he has a bodyguard ability that essentially extends into combat. So you're going to have to make sure he's dead before you want to attack the character that he's defending. Up next, we've got the other 2 snipers in this book. That means that yes, there are 3 snipers in this army. We've got the Kelemorph first, I think everybody's favourite. He, of course, has got 3 pistols. They're 2 shots each at strength 5-1 damage, or he can take a Relic, which is strength 6 minus 3 damage. Really powerful, especially when coupled with his abilities. So he is able to fire and fade essentially. It's one of those abilities that says a normal move as well. So he can fire, move 6 inches and get into a transport if he'd like. He is also able to do this even after he has come in from deep strike. So that means that he can get a very reliable charge if he'd like to, for example, and tie some things up. His gunslinger ability means that each time he shoots, he can make additional shots for the number of hits he got in the previous round of fire. And then finally, if the Kelemorph does kill anything in your army, he will grant a reroll once the hit aura, so not too shabby. And so the final sniper to talk about is the Sanctus. He's got a bunch of abilities. He automatically hits when he shoots, which means that he automatically grants a crossfire token, and anything he shoots doesn't gain the benefit of cover. If he doesn't take the sniper, he's taking the bio dagger. That is a weapon where on a 3-up to wound, it will just deal a mortal wound and the attack sequence ends. And most interestingly, he's a cloaked assassin, which means that he cannot be shot at all unless you are within 12 inches of him. The Kelemorph and Sanctus also have access to their own stratagems that are really good, and I think you'll see a fair amount at the time. So the Kelemorph can essentially shoot on death with his weapons, and the Sanctus has access to neural overload. What this means is that if the Sanctus deals any damage to you in shooting or fighting, the GSE player can roll 3d6. If they roll over the leadership of the unit that took any damage, that unit loses any aura abilities till the next shooting phase, and if that unit is a Psyker, they immediately suffer perils of the warp, and so this is really good for getting enemy Psykers to blow themselves up. So next up we've got the Reductus Saboteur. She throws a lot of grenades, and her remote explosives deal 3 damage to vehicles and monsters. Playing with bombs is her thing, so she can plant explosives as an action, and this will plant a bomb on the battlefield, and if you move within 3 inches of it, you'll take some mortal wounds. And the final thing to mention is her clandestine ability. This is like the Sanctus, so she can't be shot if you're not within 12 inches of her. However, she has to be on a terrain piece in order to benefit from it. And then of course the Genestealers have their own mad scientist in this book, the Biophagus. So he can grant 3 abilities. He can grant an extra AP in combat, 6's exploding combat, or a 5+ feel no pain. And there's an upgrade, which means that before the battle, the Genestealer Cults player can select a core or aberrant unit to gain one of the effects from the start of the game. It's worth noting that these effects last for the whole game, so they are really strong once applied. And then the Biophagus may not look like a combat beast, but if you don't want to be gotcha'd, just be careful of the Injector Goad, because he has an insta-kill ability on this weapon. If they roll over the number of wounds you have remaining afterwards, that model is just destroyed. So even if you're Rabute Gilliman, the saviour of the Imperium, you can still be killed by the Mad Scientist. And then the final character to mention here is the Abominant. He doesn't deal many attacks, but they are incredibly high damage. He's got the benefits of the Aberrants that we'll talk about later, and he's also got a 5-up Feel No Pain, and Aberrants within 6 inches can reroll hit rolls. We already spoke about the Abominant, so let's talk about his Aberrants then. So these guys are some real heavy hitters in the Codex. They've got damage 3 weapons, really strong, and they're probably the toughest unit in the book. They're toughness 5, 3 wounds, and they have -1 damage. And they can also get access to that Feel No Pain from the Biophagus that we talked about before. So you can make them pretty tough to shift. There's also a stratagem for them specifically, which gives them transhuman physiology, so can't be wounded on a 1 to 3. The hybrid metamorphs are definitely something you're going to need to play around. These guys and girls fight on death if they haven't fought already in the fight phase. And then of course we can't not mention Pure Strain Genestealers, which let's face it is what this faction is all about. So Pure Strain Genestealers are really hard hitting. They're also very tough for a GSC unit with a 4-up invern. They can advance and charge, and the reason I want to stress the stats of this unit is not only are they very points efficient, but they're absolutely devastating with another one of the upgrades that we're going to look at today. So this upgrade is they came from below, and the way this works, so when the GSE player is actually deploying, when they're revealing the blips, The unit that's got this upgrade can do one of two things. They can decide to go back into reserves, but the other thing that they can do is make a pre-game move. So what this means for Genestealers is they'll make that 8-inch move. They'll then move 8 inches in their movement phase, they'll advance, and for a CP they can advance for 6 inches, and so that means they'll be moving 22 inches, and there's even a cult to boost this further, as we'll see later. So let's move on then to the fast attacks in this book. We've got two options here. The first is probably my favourite unit in the Codex, which is the Atalan Jackals unit. This unit has a bunch of abilities that are really powerful. So they're -1 to hit all of the time. They can shoot and declare a charge when they fall back. The Genestealer Cult player can choose to not deploy them as a blip and instead deploy them as normal and then make a pre-game 9-inch move. And finally, if they are shooting at an enemy unit within 6 inches of them, they can count that target as being exposed. And for 2 CP, the Genestealer Cult player can count that unit as exposed when other crossfire units shoot at that target. And I think at this point let's talk about the demolition charges, because there's a couple of strats that make them particularly effective, which we're going to look at now. So the first one is primed explosives. This means that they can do max shots with a grenade weapon or a cache of demolition charges. And there's another stratagem here that allows them to essentially use one of their grenades when they're in combat. And when they do so, they always hit on a 2+. Now this can kill the model, but firing that incredibly powerful grenade in combat means that don't just tag these guys and think you'll be fine, because they can fall back, still shoot, still charge, and they'll also hit you pretty hard if they'd like. And then let's talk about the Achilles Ridge Runner. So this unit also has access to a scout move if they'd like to instead of blipping. They've got some pretty strong firepower as well as some heavy stubbers. The Achilles Ridge Runners also have access to a couple of interesting upgrades. So they've got one for a 6-up invuln and -2 when you try and charge them, so they can shut down your units when charging from deep strike. They can increase their range and they can ignore cover, so definitely very useful. But there's a couple of stratagems that make these guys and the Jackals particularly interesting, so these units can fire and fade if they'd like to, and there's a stratagem here, Raking Fire, so if the target has both a crossfire marker and is exposed, they'll get reroll hits. And then the final two units that we want to talk about are the big vehicles for the Genestealer Cult. So we've got the Goliath Rock Grinder and the Goliath Truck. These guys haven't got a lot of gotchas for you to be aware of, but they are -1 damage. The Rock Grinders can deal some really good output both in shooting and in combat. If they've got the cache of demolition charges, you can pay for them to explode for 1 CP. So if you're not a GSC player, I think the main relics to be aware of, we've actually covered. There is the Amulet of the Void Worm that can stop you from overwatching or setting to defend. There are some pretty standard upgrades that aren't going to surprise you, but they're also not going to ruin your day, so I think that's fine. Warlord traits as well are not particularly scary if you're not a GSC player. There are a couple though that you are going to have to play around if you play against GSC. So we've got one here that allows core and pure strength Genestealer units to heroically intervene as if they were characters, so that can be really good. We've got one to allow the bearer to fight first, and we've got one here that allows the Warlord to make a normal move of up to 6 inches if the bearer is charged in this charge phase. So let's take a look at the other stratagems you're going to want to be aware of if you are not a Genestealer Cult player. So firstly, GSC players can hide one of their objectives, which is going to be really strong if they do that. Take a look at their list. Have they got some good to the last targets? Are you going to give up something like no prisoners that scores at the end of the game? It can be a really powerful stratagem when used against or with some armies. We've got a couple of stratagems here that are going to be really good for improving even your basic Genestealer Cult models. So we've got massed firearms. When used on a big blob of like 20 neophytes, it's very strong as it allows those models to auto wound on 6s to hit. So even against things like knights, this can deal a lot of wounds. We've got a stratagem that allows a unit within 12 inches to count as exposed, which is essentially a stratagem that is giving +1 to wound. And then we've got overload fuel cells. This gives +1 damage or +1 strength, and it kind of works like plasma, so on 1s to hit, the bearer's unit will suffer a mortal wound. In the charge phase, Acolyte Hybrids and Metamorphs can charge even after they've advanced, so they are going to be pretty nippy at getting across the battlefield. GSC units can reroll wounds versus monsters and vehicles with industrial weapons in combat. And then we've got a stratagem here called Tunnel Crawlers. This is really powerful against one of your units that's on a terrain piece. because when charging the unit on the terrain piece, that unit cannot fire Overwatch or set to defend, and the GSC unit themselves does not suffer the effects of difficult ground. And this becomes even more powerful when paired with an upgrade which is called Excavate, and this is an upgrade where after you've deployed, the Genestealer Cult player can select a single terrain piece on the battlefield. It is demolished, it loses light cover, heavy cover, and it gains difficult ground. So it can be really powerful for slowing down your units and allowing their units to shoot your units without having to worry about all of those cover saves, etc. And then finally, just a few gotchas to be aware of in your turn when playing against GSC. So for 1 CP, a GSC infantry unit in cover adds 1 to their armor saving throw. But for 2 CP, if declared at the start of your shooting phase, the GSC player can stop an infantry unit from being shot. So don't move all of your models in such a way to take out a big blob of neophytes, for example, because the GSC player can pay 2 CP and keep them safe. And then finally, I just wanted to mention Fanatical Devotion. So this allows GSC core units to heroically intervene 6 inches if one of their leaders nearby has been charged. So again, with Unquestioning Loyalty, it's important that you try and deal with the minions around the characters before dealing with them themselves. So those are all the things you need to know in order to play against Genestealer Cults, except for, of course, the cult-specific things. So I'm going to cover that stuff now nice and quickly. Again, just the things you need to know if you're not a GSC player. So firstly, we've got 4-Armed Emperor. These guys, their stratagem is basically the same as the Agents of Vex stratagem, so they can use this after you use a stratagem, and it will cost you 1 extra CP from that point onwards. Their psychic power as well is particularly powerful. It's going to slow down the movement of your units quite substantially and can absolutely neuter a powerful unit of yours, so you're definitely going to want to be mindful of that. And the Warlord trait for the cult with the 4-Armed Emperor is going to mean that they can use some stratagems for free, and so even if they're out of CP, do be prepared, they can still use some of those chunkier stratagems. Hive Cult, these guys are really good at playing the mission, being able to do actions and still shoot, etc. And they can fall back and shoot, so really strong on those big shooting blobs. They've got a relic where 5s to wound will ignore invulnerable saves, so that's of course very strong on something like a Patriarch. And they've got a stratagem here that allows them to place a crossfire marker. This can be really good at granting access to those other incredibly powerful crossfire related stratagems. Bladed Cog are really interesting. We've got a reroll wounds aura. When we talk about these auras, they become particularly interesting because of the Nexus, because if you give one of those auras to the Primus, the Nexus can still spread that across the battlefield, so this reroll wounds could be spread far and wide. And then Bladed Cog are going to make things that little bit more tougher. They can give a 5-up invulnerable save to units before the battle, and their psychic power is going to add 1 to armor saving throws against damage 1 attack, so really strong when combined with those strong Goliath vehicles especially. Rusted Claw are like quick and aggressive. They can reduce the AP of those -1 and -2 weapons. They've also got a relic and a Warlord trait to really enhance a Patriarch, allowing them to fall back and still do a bunch of stuff, and basically gives them kind of a fly type ability. And I feel like I've got to mention Drive-By Demolitions, because it basically allows a Rusted Claw Atalan unit to lob a demolition charge as they move past one of your units. I just think it's pretty cool, to be honest, I'm not gonna lie. Pauper Princes, one of my favourites, +1 to hit, which is always going to be strong when combined with things like Cutters, going to make them much more reliable, and they've got access to a relic, again, put that on the Primus, and you can select 2 core units anywhere on the battlefield and give them a 5-up invulnerable save. They've also got a stratagem here that, can come up if you're not wary of it, which is that if you kill any of their characters, they can spend 1 CP and give +1 to wound for melee attacks against the unit that killed that character. Twisted Helix, I suspect, is probably the most popular of the cults at this point in time. Extra strength, extra movement, and a mini transhuman there for you. Again, can buff their Patriarch, make them damage 3 with their claws, always going to be really good. Their psychic power means that hit rolls of a 6 will automatically wound the target, and when playing against Twisted Helix, try not to tie up their big aberrants with little squads, because they have got access to a stratagem to gain some extra attacks there for killing things like Horde. It's not particularly devastating, but it could counteract that kind of play. Those are all the main cults that I wanted to cover. There are some really good custom cults, so it's definitely worth checking with your opponent each time what they do, but I wouldn't really consider them gotchas for the purposes of this video. However, that does end this video. I didn't want to make this video too long, but reading through it, I felt like this is all information I'd really want to know if I was playing against Genestealer Cults. Like, all of these stratagems, all of these abilities are so good, and they will catch you out if you're not aware of them. I hope this video was really useful. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you excited to play against this faction? Are you terrified? If you want to support the channel, please do like and subscribe. And if you want to join the channel and support us that way, that would be absolutely amazing. Of course, we'll have Custodes Gotcha guides to come soon. We'll have the Tau Gotcha guide soon to come. So thanks very much for watching. See you in the next one.